Welcome to this week's episode of Being Human. I'm delighted to say our guest is Peter Morville. He's joining us from Ann Arbor in Michigan in the States. Although he is a fellow Brit, he's an author, a pioneer in the field of information architecture and a marathon runner. Peter, welcome to the show.
I'm delighted to be here.
And it's pretty early for you, right? It's dark, you were telling me before we came on.
It is early. It's still dark out, but it's not as early as 2 days ago when I got up at 4:30 in the morning to run my first ultra marathon.
Oh wow! How long is that?
So I turned 50 in early September, and so I decided to run a 50K. So one kilometer for each year I've been alive.
Wow. And isn't that something you could, well, we'll get into your book, but your latest book, Planning for Everything, you talk about every year you have like a big mission. Is that right?
I try. I don't believe in New Year's resolutions. A New Year's resolution is one of those things that you always say, I'm going to be better at this, and then you fail and forget. And so I try to come up with a plan every year. And this year I was sort of late. I waited till this early summer. And then just kind of in a spur of the moment, just decided, let me try my first ultra.
Wow. And was that running all the way, or was there a bit of walking? Or
it was a bit of walking. This race is called Dances with Dirt, and it's physically impossible to run the whole thing because you go up incredibly steep hills, you go through muddy bogs, you go up a river, and you go through the forest, where the hardest part is finding the next flag to keep on the trail. So it was part marathon and part puzzle.
Right. Well, in fact, I had a friend at university who did orienteering challenges where they'd do something like that. You'd run a bunch, and then you'd get into the middle of a wood. You have to solve a puzzle.
Yeah, so it was hard, but it was more fun than I expected.
Wow. Well, congratulations. And are you planning on doing any more ultras?
No. Yeah, I think one's probably enough for me.
Right.
There's still some other crazy things out there in the world to do.
Do you know what's next on the list then? What's the next?
I have no idea. No, I think I should maybe take it easy for a few weeks.
Right. Fair enough. Yes. So I'm sure a big section of our listenership will know what we mean by information architecture. That's your background and perhaps why you're most famous, or what you're most famous for. But for those who aren't familiar with that, I wonder if we start there and then skip to your latest book. What do we mean by information architecture, and I suppose its impact on the world today? I think that might be useful for some people to understand.
Yeah, it's funny. I haven't actually been asked to define information architecture for a little bit. There were times where I was doing that every day. I go back to why I started doing this in the first place. I went through library school in the early 1990s, and I was convinced that a lot of the traditional principles of librarianship that had been operating in the physical world for centuries had some value in this new emerging digital world, the early online computer networks and the internet. And so when I started working on the internet and online environments, my passion, kind of coming from a library background, was to help people find what they need. So findability was really my passion. Information architecture is what we ended up kind of describing the practice, the field of work, which is really around structuring and organizing information, designing information environments. For multiple reasons. Still at the core of it is findability. But if you think about the various goals of user experience, you're also thinking about credibility and authority and desirability and accessibility. And so there's a lot of things you need to be thinking about as you're designing an information architecture. In the most practical sense, when you think about information architecture, people think about organization, structure, navigation, search, labeling, right? All of those pieces of software or a website that basically form the structure, or to borrow from the metaphor, right? It's the foundation or the blueprint for the house.
Right. Right. And to give a sense of how how it's being used and how it shapes our experiences today, it may be useful for people to understand. I think. What can you share there?
Yeah. So I'm we wrote the polar bear book on information architecture. It was published in 1998. And that we were fortunate with timing, right? That was a time when everybody was interested in the internet, and so our book sold phenomenally well. And that was kind of that next few years was sort of the peak time of interest in information architecture. And people, graphic designers were just changing their business cards overnight to read information architect, right? That was the sexy job title for a couple of years, and that was kind of fun. But the attention died down and shifted to other places. But the basic work hasn't changed since the 1990s. The process that I go through, I start with background research to kind of get a sense of, with my clients, what do you already know? What kinds of research have you already done? Take a look at your analytics, that sort of thing. Then I'm going to do user research to try to understand how do users use your existing site or software, and what are their mental models and their information seeking behaviors. I'm going to talk with stakeholders to have a sense of current goals and plans, metrics, and to make them feel part of the process. And then we're going to start kind of coming up with information architecture strategy. And that first takes form in narrative, in kind of a narrative form, where you're kind of trying to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of what are the goals and what's the direction. But what information architecture doesn't really click until you get to the point where you're doing sketches or wireframes or prototypes, and people start to see the bare bones of structure for the site, right? So it's, here are the links, here's what, the labels for those links, here's what you can do on a page, here's where you can go. And that's where people kind of get what information architecture is, right? Before you start worrying about the graphic design or visual design, the colors and fonts and images, you're trying to get that structure right so that people can understand where they are and where they can go. And that can then follow through to great levels of detail in terms of mapping out various pages and interfaces throughout the site, and getting into, we can kind of get back to some of the library science stuff where you might have controlled vocabularies and taxonomies that you have to really get into depth with with vocabularies and kind of making sure each word is right.
Right. And to what extent then has it become part of user experience? Because that seems to be like the major interest now, right? How do those two intertwine?
Yeah. So we were a lot of the folks who helped to pioneer the user experience field were kind of active in the information architecture community before UX was a thing. And I mean, Jesse James Garrett really deserves credit for taking a number of acronyms like IA and IXD, right, which was interaction design, and kind of showing how the pieces of building a user experience can fit together, from the sort of the goals and strategy, all the way up to the interaction and interface design, and showing that information architecture was a piece of that. So I've always, to be a little provocative, I've always argued that information architecture is a subset of user experience and vice versa. Because there are things that we do in information architecture that aren't really driven by what are we trying to achieve for the user. There are things we're trying to do that are kind of more driven by the business. And there are times as an information architect where we're thinking more about how do we work with the technology side. You can argue everything's part of UX if you want to, but if you have a kind of a more, kind of realistic definition of UX, I don't think it fully contains IA.
Right. And in terms of where you see the field now and the kind of state, I suppose, of digital experiences, where have we got to go with information architecture? What's next, or what's current in terms of the big areas of interest?
So I mentioned that IA fell out of favor in the early 2000s, and I don't think that is sort of an accident of history. I think of information architecture in the same sense as systems thinking, which was really big in the 1970s. Some of the top books on the subject of systems thinking sold millions of copies, and then everyone forgot about it. Most people, you stop someone on the street and ask them, do you know what systems thinking is? They've never heard of it. And I think that's because what systems thinking and information architecture share in common is an interest in looking beneath the surface at deeper layers of complexity and acknowledging sort of second and third order effects of what you do. And I think that most people have an immune response to this. It's uncomfortable. They like to focus more on the surface and the idea of quick wins, and not necessarily looking at the longer term effects and trying to figure out strategy. And so I think that these subjects kind of get pushed down a little bit. So what I see in the business world today is an amnesia. A lot of what we, a lot of the knowledge that we developed, the skills and practices around information architecture that we developed in the 90s and early 2000s have been forgotten by many UX teams, right? So very often when I'm working today, I'm brought into an organization that has a significant user experience operation going, right? They might have 10 or 20 or 50 people, none of whom have any deep information architecture expertise. So before we worry too much about how to advance, the kind of cutting edge of information architecture, we really need to figure out some ways to make sure that people who are practicing UX have a better kind of IA tool set, because people are just making the mistakes that we kind of figured our way around in the 1990s. So part of it's just like getting the basics right. That I'm seeing that's not happening in most business environments today.
Right. And if we take that thesis, then what's the impact? What's of people not getting the kind of 101 right for businesses and users?
Yeah, terribly frustrating user experiences. You can't find stuff that you should be able to find, and it gets worse because the other thing that's going on, to kind of go back to why I got into this work in the first place, it was to help people find what they need. My passion has always been for helping the end user achieve their goal, right? For making it better for that person. But now that UX has become a more integral part of business, right? That we have a seat at the table, which is what people kept saying we needed. That comes with a cost, and the cost is that there's now powerful business forces saying, well, we don't care that much about the end user. In fact, we want to take advantage of that end user, right? We want more money from that end user. We want them to look at our advertising. And so it's, beyond the intellectual challenges of figuring out how to provide a good user experience, there's the kind of the business and cultural forces that are saying, well, let's sacrifice the quality of the user or customer experience in order to make a few more dollars. And so you see, Amazon is an example of a site that at one point had a very solid information architecture. But we've seen them in the last few years increasingly putting advertising into their own search results, right? Which is the equivalent of I go to a bookstore and there's, I can't actually get to the book I want because I've got advertisements shoved in my face. And very frustrating is, so that's another challenge, right? There's the amnesia. We've sort of forgotten much of what we learned. And then there's the sort of the other pressures from the kind of the capitalist front.
Right. Okay. So, and the ultimately it's impacting end users with findability. And actually, I resonate with that. I mean, it's interesting to me that you kind of I'm still having experiences where I can't find stuff on some of my favorite sites. I'll put in a search and I expect to be able to find it, and I'll end up going to Google to see if I can find it on their site through Google. Right? I mean, I do that quite often, and it is interesting to me how long has search on websites been around and people are still not getting it right. Yeah. And so my other thought there is then what's your prescription, if you're a frustrated user experience architect or just a frustrated sort of business stakeholder or owner and kind of resonate with what you're saying here and want to know how to fix it.
Yeah, so I have a couple different responses to that. So first, there's still a lot of good we can do within the context of user experience and sort of, digital design. We can make sure that we do our homework, that we do, we kind of do the reading and the learning, so that we really know what we're doing, and then we can do our best to share that. And when I'm working with organizations today, I try to build more education and more kind of co-creation into the process. So I work more closely with my clients. We do more workshops. I invite them to participate in the user research. I help them to understand why we're designing an information architecture the way we are, because I've become more aware over time that the superhero designer who kind of comes in and shows the interface or the wireframes and saves the day, right? Those are quick wins, right? You feel good for a little bit, but if nobody understands the information architecture, then as it gets into the hands of designers and developers, it's going to be changed and changed and changed until some of the the initial strengths are gone. So I've kind of learned, if you really want to make a lasting impact in an organization, change the people, right? Help them to understand, because they will live a lot longer than your specific ideas for a website or software product. So there's a lot of good we can do in the environments in which we practice, through education, by setting a good example, by we have to pick our battles, but we should pick some and we should fight for the user when we can. But I also think that that especially for practitioners in kind of my peer group, right? For folks who are hitting their 50s and maybe have some freedom to try something different, I think that it's worth asking the question, can I do more good outside this context, right? I've heard people over the years just sort of ask, how can we use UX or IA to make the world a better place? And I think that's a good question, but I don't think it should be asked at the expense of saying, how can I make the world a better place independent of what I've been doing for the last 20 years, right? Like you don't have to force that skill set into your new goals or future. So for me, I have this idea of creating an animal sanctuary and using it as an opportunity to kind of teach people, help people to be kinder to animals. And that's sort of a passion for me. I kind of see myself, next 25 years, that's kind of what I would like to be doing. And I was thinking about it this morning in anticipation of this interview, and I thought, in a sense, when I started out 25 years ago, my mission was I want to help people find what they need. Okay, and we've seen in the last few years some of the problems with that with kind of the internet and findability. People find a lot of garbage, right? People aren't always good at finding what they need. They find what's easy, and can be very misleading. So there's an irony that as an information professional, someone who's dedicated my career to kind of issues all in and around the information world, that I've come up against the limits of information, right? Just providing access to information has some real limits. And so when I think about the next 25 years, I'm more interested in, instead of helping people find what they need, I'm interested in helping people change what they want, right? And that's kind of gets into cultural and moral issues. And I don't. It's not that I have the answers for that. I'm going to allow myself 25 years to figure it out. But that, I'm excited by this idea of really shifting what I'm doing. I think there may be some interesting connections between, the world of internet and software and UX and IA and what I want to do next. But I'm giving myself the freedom to kind of shift. So I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense, and I can see the parallels there in terms of your professional work, because you're saying on the one hand you shift your sort of professional stance to be more about education and having people get interested in perhaps different things and coming up with a kind of killer design, which in a sense is changing what people want.
Yeah.
and you're also seeking to do that with the animal sanctuary or sentient sanctuary. Is that still how you're referring to it?
Yeah, that's my working name for it, and maybe the ultimate name for it is Sentient Sanctuary, with the idea of helping to increase happiness and reduce suffering for all sentient beings.
Wow.
It's a modest goal.
Well, and again, I can see the parallel with information architecture, right? I'm happy if I find the right thing and I reduce my suffering if I'm not beating my head.
Absolutely.
A wall trying to find it. Okay. And this is born out of, and we will get more into the book, Planning for Everything, but you mentioned it in Planning for Everything. You've got a weekly commitment to walk dogs.
Oh, yeah. So in the wake of our last presidential election, I was feeling pretty demoralized and frustrated and kind of helpless. And I really felt like I needed to do something good that had nothing to do with the internet. I was a little tired of business and digital. And so I decided to start walking dogs at our local humane society. And that was a few years ago, and I've been doing, once a week, I walk dogs for an hour or two. At first it was a little scary, going into a kennel with a large pit bull that I've never met before. They've got very big jaws, but most of them are super friendly, and halfway through the walk, they're rolling on their backs and asking for a belly rub. So that's been good to kind of, to maintain my sanity through the craziness of the last few years. And for me, it was a bit of a test, having spent most of my last 25 years doing things that in one sense or another were more selfish, right? So, as a consultant, right, I'm doing work that I think is important, but I'm getting paid well for it. And I'm looking after my family. But this was an experiment to sort of see, can I feel happy and fulfilled doing things for others, right? And in this case, it was for these dogs that really need an extra walk or two. And it's been great. It's been often taking a dog for a walk at the Humane Society has been the best part of my week. You're stressed and there's too much going on, and you get out there and it's kind of get out in this path in the woods with the dog, and you just start to feel really good, and maybe the sun pops out and all of a sudden it's kind of magical, and you think, I wouldn't rather be doing anything else.
Wow. And it was during one of these walks that the idea for Sentient Sanctuary came to you, or?
Um, not so much. The 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 idea for Sentient Sanctuary, it definitely popped up while I was writing my book on planning, and it came as a result of changing how I think about time. So, for ever since I turned 40, I had this idea. Okay, I want to work really hard, try to save as much money as I can, and create the opportunity when I turn 50 to do something different. Right, just create a little bit of freedom. But I didn't know what that different thing was. And then as kind of each year ticked by, I felt frustrated that I couldn't come up with anything else I wanted to do. Which, in one sense, I really do enjoy being an information architect, and I plan to continue doing that for at least several years. So my challenge was find something I want to do more than what I'm doing. The best thing I had ever come up with was, well, maybe I'll teach, right? And I did a little bit of that a while back at the School of Information here at the University of Michigan, and it's fine. Like, I have no problem with teaching. It can be a good thing to do, as you slide into semi-retirement, or for your profession if that's what you choose. But I just felt that I was suffering from a failure of the imagination. Right? It's like, okay, if you can do something different, what? Couldn't come up with it. And then what helped me was for some reason, I kind of came up with this idea of, instead of thinking what would I do for the next few years, I organized my life into 25-year chunks. And so I said, okay, so life one was, being a kid, growing up, going to school, 0 to 25. And then 25 to 50 roughly was, raising a family and having a career, right? So I raised a family. Our girls just went off to college. We now have an empty nest, and I've been an information architect for 25 years. So life three, right, is 50 to 75. And the thing that was freeing for me, that opened my mind, was recognizing, wow, 25 years, right? And if I'm lucky, I could be pretty healthy and productive through those 25 years. I could do something fairly substantial and really different, right? I can do something. I can start out being terrible at what I'm doing, and by the end, I could be pretty good at it. And for whatever reason, that gave me the freedom to. I sort of thought back to that life one when I was a kid, and what was it that I really loved to do, and I loved animals, right? And they haven't been as big a part of my last 25 years because I've been busy and raising a family. But when I was a kid, I wanted to be a veterinarian. I loved anything to do with animals, and I thought, I want to kind of go back to that, and I want to find something that allows me to be much more connected to animals and nature, and figure out a way to help animals and people through this process.
Right. And how do you see it helping people? I get for the animals.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so that's a good question. So I've been doing a lot of research the last few years in and around this topic, and there's all sorts of ways in which people interacting with animals are therapeutic, for the people, for sure, maybe for the animals, but there's a lot of work that's been done with equine therapy, right, where people with really severe psychological problems have breakthroughs interacting with horses, and there's a wonderful story around an existing animal sanctuary that's called the Gentle Barn. This woman, Ellie Lax, as a kid, she had a tough childhood, and animals were her lifeline, kind of helped her survive her childhood. And when she grew up, she decided she couldn't help herself. She was kind of collecting animals, right? So she sort of had an animal sanctuary in her home for a while. But her vision was, I want to create a safe place where animals can come to heal. And once they've healed, I then want to invite children, teenagers who are hurting in one way or another, from folks, kids from disadvantaged backgrounds, from difficult situations, and I want to have the animals help them to heal. And it's been tremendously successful, and there's now multiple kind of sanctuaries around the country that are kind of under this umbrella of the Gentle Barn. And that's not exactly what I want to do. I'm still figuring out the exact form that I want my sanctuary to take, but it's an inspiration for it, right? It's the idea that, it's not just, creating this beautiful place with, and, that sort of provides a safe space for animals, also then becomes a place to invite people where they can, at a minimum, just have some moments of happiness and joy. But there's also the potential for healing, which I think, given where we are in the world today, and our society's difficulty with dealing with issues of grief and trauma and death and dying, I just think that there's some real opportunities to help, if you can create the right kind of sanctuary.
Right. Okay. And have you, as any kind of are there any principles or guidelines, or is there some semblance of structure emerging around this sanctuary?
So here, I think the best way to answer that is to say I'm kind of committed to starting small and learning as I go. So I kind of, even it's ironic because to some degree, being an information architect, I've been pitted against things like agile and lean, right? Because when often you sort of, they take the simplistic form of, like, let's do things with no plan, right? The sort of anti-planning, let's just throw something on the wall and see if it sticks. That's not the true spirit of lean or agile, but it's the form you see it take sometimes. So I've been pitted against those sometimes, but I really believe strongly for this in sort of starting with a minimal viable product. So my wife and I, our immediate plans are, in the next year or two, we want to buy some beautiful land in Colorado. We're going to start with a minimal viable product kind of set of animals. So it's gonna be like, a couple dogs, a couple cats, some goats, some chickens, a llama. That's probably about
giraffes.
No giraffes to start. And so no more than half a dozen to a dozen animals. Start kind of doing an Airbnb thing, right? So inviting people to come and spend some time there and have a tour and visit with the animals, but do it at a kind of a small, manageable level, and start to develop my principles and practices, the way that we want to do this, in a very small way first, and then iterate. So there are principles I have in mind. The most important one being, this is really about helping people to understand that all animals are living beings with, that, and they all think and feel and deserve respect, just as each human being does. That's the most underlying principle, and that I think we can actually be happier as a species and as a set of societies if we have that kindness and compassion for all creatures. That's the kind of underlying principle. But exact form of how we're sort of enabling people to interact and who we're inviting, and that's all going to emerge over time. I have tons and tons of ideas. I just don't want to cling to any of them from the beginning.
Right. Right, I get that. And you're a vegan, is that right?
Mostly. I'm it's funny because people, there's a in the information architect, you'll never find a community that is against, that doesn't like being labeled as much as the information architecture community, right? We understand the power of labels and language, and so we don't like to be labeled ourselves. And so, I think that there's a lot of baggage around the word vegan, right? It can really activate people's resistance and anger. And, oh, you're one of those. And I don't think there's anything wrong with the word. I think that I don't really like categorizing people. I prefer to think of sort of that for most things we exist on a spectrum, right? It's like, so from an interface design perspective, I'd prefer sliders to checkboxes, right? Instead of sort of saying check, are you a vegan? Check. Are you a Presbyterian? Check. It's like, how veganish are you, right? So I'm fairly high on the vegan spectrum, but not all the way.
Right. Okay. And it's interesting because that's very current for people doing ultra marathons and so on. It's a big movement right now. Is vegan athletes, isn't it? Especially in that field.
Yeah, I was searching for inspiration last week because I was terrified of doing this ultra. Like, I didn't know if I could do it. I was scared, and so I was searching for inspiration, and I actually discovered this woman in the UK called Fiona Oakes, who, and it was a weird convergence of my interests because she's just about my age. For the last 20 years or so, she's been running an animal sanctuary in England, and she runs marathons and ultra marathons to bring attention to the cause. But she's on a whole nother level. Like, she holds world records. She has a world record for running a marathon on every continent and the North Pole in the shortest period of time. Like, she is a superhero. But she's a vegan, and so she's trying to bring attention to the idea that you can be vegan and still be pretty healthy.
Right. That's great. It reminds me of these super stacked vegan bodybuilders, right? You give the lie to you can't get your protein. These guys are definitely getting their protein. Right. Let's get to the book. I know we've kind of toured around it a little bit actually.
Uh-huh.
But, Planning for Everything. The second of your books that I read Intertwingled, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and really was happy to have the opportunity to read this one. So yeah, give us a little bit of the genesis for the book, and then we'll get into some of the main points that you make.
Yeah. So the book's called Planning for Everything: the Design of Paths and Goals. I'm a bit of a contrarian, so I wrote this book fully recognizing that the pendulum had swung very strongly towards agile and lean, and as I was working on the book, Facebook's mantra of "move fast and break things" was still in vogue. Not so sure it is today. But so I wrote the book knowing it was going against the grain to some degree, advocating that people really think about planning. Now, the word planning, that's another one like vegan that carries a lot of baggage, right? And so one of the things I try to do in the book is advocate for striking a balance between what you might call big upfront planning, which in some cases is absolutely needed, but has its problems too. Strike a balance between big upfront planning and improvisation, and that my definition of planning is about finding that balance in your context, right? So if you're constructing a skyscraper, you have to do a lot of upfront planning. There's no way around it. You can't just change course halfway up the structure, right? But if you're doing, if you're creating software or a website, there may be room for more agility. I think sometimes that's exaggerated. It actually is quite hard to change course halfway through building a software product, but people like to pretend that you can't. So, there are contexts, like if you're doing a startup in a totally new space, then creating a minimal viable product and putting it out in the market and getting real feedback and seeing really is there a demand and shifting your strategy based on what you learned makes tons of sense, right? You really want to iterate rapidly when you're creating a brand new product in a new market. But when you're redesigning a site for a Fortune 500, you're going to have to do a decent amount of upfront planning because there's so many people and organizations involved in realizing a particular vision, that changing course halfway through is quite destructive. So anyway, the idea of the book is to encourage people to strike a balance. And I wrote the book. This is my first book that I really wrote more for a general audience. While it does have relevance to people who are in the design world, my actual argument is that the design practices that we've all been kind of contributing to over the last 20, 30 years, they have tremendous value outside of our context, right? And so some of the idea of the book is taking the principles and practices of design and applying them to the challenge of planning more broadly. And my stretch goal for the book was I wanted parents to hand the book to their teenager and saying, you need to get better at planning, read this book. Maybe you'll get your homework done. Maybe you'll get into college.
Right. So taking the principles of design and applying them to planning. So you're bringing attention to the idea that it's important for us to design how we plan. Is that?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, and the subtitle, The Design of Paths and Goals, sort of speaks to the notion that while sometimes we tend to think in a limited way, a narrow way about planning, we sort of say, well, it's easy. You define your goal and then you just write a list of steps. Here's how I achieve it, right? So I want to make an omelet. So, get some eggs, get some mushrooms, get some cheese, butter, whatever. But I try to also place attention on the design of the goals themselves, right? To kind of invite people to reflect on, why do I think this goal is going to make me happy or is going to satisfy my needs? Have I fully thought that out? And is it possible that an alternate goal would be better? I think that so there's a lot of invitation in the book towards reflection and mindfulness and really questioning the goals, not just taking them for granted.
Right, as an important part of designing the planning process, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And you talk about framing when you cite the Marine handbook.
Yeah. So when I was doing research for the book, it was surprising to me that the single most valuable resource I found out there, I looked through all sorts of books and searching online, I found the Marine's Guide to Planning, right? And it's like this official U.S. government publication. It's a PDF file. You can find it for free via Google. And it was remarkably mature and sophisticated in how it approached planning. And once I found, so it was a surprise to me at first, but then once I thought about it, it made sense, right? Because, and the Marines, in the Marines, you're sending a small group of people into harm's way, into life or death situations. You absolutely want to have a good plan. You want to have a good goal. But you also, that team needs to be able to adapt based on conditions on the ground, right? Something's going to go wrong. The bridge has been blown out, whatever. You can't get to the hill. Like, you need to be able to adapt, to improvise. In order to do that, you need to understand not only the goal, but the commander's intent, right? What are we actually trying to achieve? Like, just because they said, get on top of that hill and defend it, well, why are we trying to defend the top of that hill? Maybe we're trying to protect the village or the road below. Maybe there's another way to accomplish that goal now that we can't accomplish that intent now that we can't accomplish the goal. So yeah, so the Marines have a wonderful approach towards planning that explicitly uses the word design. Right? They talk about designing the plan, and they talk about framing as the most difficult and most important step in the planning process. And that's where the goal and intent come into play as well, right? Because framing is both how we understand and explain a plan. And I think those are connected. And so this is where a lot of other folks who talk about planning will try to make it sound simple with respect to the goal. They'll just say, well, step 1, define your goal. Well, so I use the term framing to try to help people step back. And it's not just about, defining or writing down your goal. It's about thinking a little bit more broadly about what are we trying to achieve, why, what are alternate ways to achieve the same goal? Are there maybe sub goals we could different ways to break this up into different, there's so many different ways to understand and explain a plan. And this is the part we often want to skip over because it makes our heads hurt. Okay? This is the hard part. It's like information architecture. It's like systems thinking. It's hard, and it's hard to do. It's hard to talk about, and yet it's the most important piece, right? Like how you frame something has an enormous impact on whether or not you can get other people to buy into the plan, and it has a huge impact on whether or not you can achieve it. So again, people skip over the hard part because it's hard, but I try to encourage people to kind of dig in more at that early stage. Kind of go slow to go fast.
Right. And thinking through how you're going to communicate this, how you're going to explain it, how connect to people. Right.
Yeah.
And that is a yes, because we think quite often in terms of, well, how do we get this as precise as it needs to be, and how is it going to be measurable, and it becomes quite a technical task around definition, and less about communication, I suppose.
Once you get past that point, then you can come up with all kinds of detailed task lists, and you can send everyone off, and it's like, oh, the real work's happening. Like, this is great. We're making progress. The pain happens, 6 weeks or 6 months later when it doesn't all come together. But if you don't get the framing right, and you just skip through that, you can very quickly get to the illusion of productivity. And that's what often in organizations, people are so worried about showing that they're moving forward quickly that they skip over the hard part.
Right. And it feels good. We talked earlier about people having an immune response to information architecture. I think there's something about people having an immune response to sort of not being or not feeling productive or busy or getting on with things. Right?
Absolutely. And in fact, the first time I taught my planning workshop at a conference, then one of the people raised their hands early on, and they said, what you need to understand, like, we need help because our executives are allergic to planning, right? And so they're kind of sharing like how hard it is to just do some of this early work. It's the same with research, right? Like, it's gotten a lot easier over the years in the context of user experience. But when we were practicing information architecture in the 90s, and we said, well, we want to do some user research, we want to go out and talk with and observe real users, people would look at us like we're crazy, right? Like, well, but no, we want to start doing the real work. Like, let's code some HTML.
Right. Yeah. No, I can. That resonates, and possibly why, in a sense, Agile's become so popular.
Absolutely, yeah.
So at least in some contexts, and why there's been the blowback because it's become associated with those.
Yeah,
who aren't
move fast and break things. Right? Well, we've started to see what happens when things break.
Yeah. And then you talk about, which is to me is resonant of this design thinking, where you talk about imagining and then narrowing. Could you share a bit on that?
Yeah. Yeah, so I kind of reference the double diamond of design, right? Where the first diamond is about um, uh, you know making sure that you're creating the right product, um, and so it's really kind of an opening up of this possibility space. So imagining, uh, I have a whole chapter that's focused on, what are all the ways in which we can be more creative in coming up with possibilities, right? What might we do? Um, and then, in the next chapter, we go the opposite direction with narrowing. This is another case where that's hard and not so much fun, right? The imagining is fun, right? Everyone wants to brainstorm and get on the whiteboard, play with post-it notes. Like, that's the fun part. That's really the bread and butter of the design world, is imagining. But narrowing is just as important. It's just more painful because what is it? I think in the world of writing, they talk about killing your babies or killing your darlings, right? It's like, some of those ideas that you loved, you have to get rid of for one reason or another, and try to get down to a realistic set of possibilities where you can then make a really good decision about which path are we going to take.
Yeah. Yeah, yes, yeah, and I think it's what you're doing here. It's an important contribution because, especially when I read a lot of, say, the agile literature, that is sometimes skirted over to some extent. Well, you have a backlog, and then at some point you have a ceremony, and somebody, maybe it's a product owner, makes a decision about the priority. But I suppose there isn't a great deal of investment in exploring that process, really, from an opening up and a narrowing, right? It's, yeah, I can see why you're drawing attention to that.
Yeah, and I when I was doing some interviews, interviewing people as kind of basic research for my book, and I talked with a couple of folks who were from an agile consultancy, and it was very refreshing because these were all kind of hardcore software developers who started out as kind of like true believing agilistas, with no sprint zero, right? You just dive right in and start doing stuff. And they said over the years, they learned the hard way that there really was a need for some upfront research and design and planning. And so they actually had a phase that they called the RDP phase. It comes before the sprints, and it's called research, design, and planning. And for me, that was refreshing because it kind of gets outside of the hype, and it's just like, here's a group who really wants to do good work, and they found that the marriage of some upfront research, design, and planning with the agile methodology worked, right? And that totally makes sense to me, right? I'm not anti-agile. I just think you got to strike the balance. And so again, that's part of why I wrote the book, was to try to kind of encourage people to fight for that balance a little more.
Right, and I can see how that balance is going to be very different in different contexts, as you alluded to when we started this section of the conversation. Right, in some cases, a sprint zero might be, or no sprint zero, it might be absolutely right, and in some cases, a very long period of planning may be more appropriate. Yeah, I can see that. And then you talk about the sort of deciding and executing and moving forward.
Yeah, and just to kind of step back and provide a frame, like the framework that we're working our way through. For the book, I use this mnemonic or memory device of STARFINDER, right? And so the STAR part, the first four, those are the principles of planning that I encourage: social, tangible, agile, and reflective, right? So I sort of, my argument is, if you want to get better at planning, then make your planning process more social, tangible, agile, and reflective. And so social, for instance, means involve people early and often in the planning process, right? It's going to be easier for you to get started, and you're going to get better ideas if you involve other people. what we're now working our way through is the second piece, the finder piece, right? So framing, imagining, narrowing, deciding, executing, and reflecting. And so you just asked about the deciding and executing part. So deciding, oh, and by the way, a starfinder is like, it's actually a map of the night sky that helps you find your way, right? So that, it kind of makes sense here.
Well, and actually, just as you shared that, and you remind me now of the mnemonic, but the social aspect of this, you talked about, was it General McChrystal or somebody, a general who had this rule of just CC anybody who you think might be of interest, and basically share unless you think it might be illegal, right?
Yeah, I mean, here's one of the most senior military officers in the U.S. I believe in the Middle East. The U.S. is being kind of beaten down by very freewheeling terrorist kind of groups, and he realizes the whole process of command and control, this very fixed, rigid system of communication, and sort of sending orders down the line is absolutely failing. And so he shifts to a network kind of based model, and there's just some wonderful practical details of that, like having conference calls where his most important meeting of the week is a conference call in which he basically allows like anyone within the forces there to join and listen in. So and the same with the email, right? CCing everyone who could possibly have anything to do with what's going on, because he realized that at the top of the hierarchy, it's impossible to predict who might need this information. And so he just shared to a level that was almost illegal, right? That was like, that people thought was insane. And yet by giving that information, spreading it more widely, people were able to connect dots and say, oh my goodness, I just saw this activity going on, and I think that connects to what he was just saying, or that email I just saw, and we need to take action now, right? And then there was also the empowering kind of giving people more freedom to act without it coming all the way down the chain of command, and it was incredibly successful, right? So I don't spend a lot of my time studying military strategy, but that story was really powerful, and I think has tremendous relevance for business contexts as well.
Yeah, and it certainly seems to be a theme through a lot of these interviews, this idea of transparency as being a sort of really significant enabler for good planning, agile ways of working. It just seems to recur as being very important, and almost a characteristic of these very effective cultures for organizations dealing in complex environments.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most interesting parts about working on this book was digging into the topics in and around predicting the future, because planning, right, is always an act of trying to predict, anticipate, and shape the future. And on the one hand, we all acknowledge, like, you can't predict the future, right? Like, in one sense, there's always going to be, things that we miss. On the other hand, we can't not predict the future. It's what we do. It's like it's a core survival instinct. Our ability to predict what do we think will happen if we jump off this cliff, or if we walk past the saber-toothed tiger, right? Like, our ability to predict the actions of others and the consequences of our actions is what has helped us survive as a species. And humans are particularly good at it in the sense of being able to predict sort of longer term things. So you can't talk about planning seriously unless you kind of dig into our ability and to predict. And then, but a piece of that is being very mindful of how, we have mental models of the world. We have mental models of each other. Those mental models are quick and dirty, right? They're kind of, they're sort of good enough some of the time, but they are all flawed. And so that's why when we make a plan, there's a very good chance there's something we're going to have missed that's going to kind of surprise us, which is why we need to design also for improvisation, for, have a plan B and a plan C. And, but trying to predict who's going to need this information in the organization, at a certain level is an act of hubris, right? Like, my mental model is so good that I know who needs the information and who doesn't, right? You're almost certainly wrong. And so I think, as I was working on the book, the idea of humility kept coming back to me, of just acknowledging that we all have very limited understandings of the true complexity of the world and how all these different parts might kind of intersect. And if you have some humility going into the process, that while it's good to have a plan, your plan will change, and that's okay, right? Nobody has a perfect knowledge of the future.
Right. Yeah. So there's two ideas there that are coming through. There's absolutely the idea of the humility of the leader who is in a senior position and to some extent directing, and then that they're not, that it's not going to be the perfect plan. And then there's the social aspect of this, which enables improvisation, right? You can't really envisage improvisation without some level of social connection between the individuals, right?
Yeah.
So who are you riffing off? If I think of a jazz band, you can't really improvise on your own, and you can't really improvise if you've just been handed a set of instructions. So this social element is very important.
I did a project in the I guess the early 2000s for a big Silicon Valley tech company, one of the old guard, and we were working on their kind of intranet or employee portal, and they had this really kind of harsh top-down culture where they'd been through a series of intranets, and each one had sort of failed. And so then they'd have a big project that would create a new one and totally wipe out the other one, try to wipe out all traces of it. And everyone was kind of forced and told that they had to use the official version of the intranet. Well, one of the things that we discovered in our research was that a collection of administrative assistants had created this really beautiful annotated kind of directory of all the most important information, contacts, resources for them. It was a shared kind of activity of kind of constantly adding to this list, and that was their version of the intranet, right? It was a bottom up version, and they kind of kept it quiet. Like it took a little bit of work for us to uncover it, but it was a crazy situation where they're spending millions of dollars creating a top-down version that nobody liked. And meanwhile, their own people, just to get their work done, are creating wonderful, valuable resources, but they're afraid that they'll get in trouble for doing it, right? So there was a problem there.
Yeah. No, that's that reminds me of another client I worked with that I don't want to give too much away but yes, there was a fringe group who created an extremely successful website that was doing great things for the overall mission of this organization, and we're terrified every day that we're going to get fired for having done it, right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So we were getting back to the sort of the tail end of your framework here, the deciding and the executing. Yeah. So what did you sort of uncover studying those areas?
Yeah. So a little bit like framing for deciding, it was an interesting challenge to write a whole chapter on deciding. but and to a certain extent, my whole kind of StarFinder framework, right? The finder, breaking the process of planning out into 6 phases and each deserving of a chapter, really stretches out the idea of planning. But I think there's value in that to get us to really examine each piece of the process. And that's particularly true with deciding, where we tend to have this kind of simplistic mental model that, and then I decided, right? Like it just happened, right? And the decision was made, and yet, deciding is, I think that we have that simplistic notion because deciding is something that happens in kind of an implicit, tacit way that we don't totally understand. It's not always fully conscious, right? This is where, so a simple way of explaining it is folks who have any level of mindfulness about their own decision making know the value of sleeping on it, or of going for a walk before you make the decision, right? Giving it a little bit of time. Even, sometimes we make our best decisions in the shower, right? It's like, it's when you let your mind rest and you're not consciously thinking of this difficult decision or choice, and our mind's doing something that all of a sudden we're like, we get it. And sometimes, that eureka moment where the right path can be a whole body experience. That's where you get the tingling, all around your body. And because it's not only your conscious mind, your rational mind that makes the decision. It's tying into our emotions and the wisdom that comes from our kind of emotion and our sort of subconscious mind. And so, I try to tease apart this idea of making a decision because I think we need to give it a little bit more time and space. And I try to just in the spirit of being creative and thinking outside the box, I sort of encourage things like, if you're struggling with a really difficult decision, try writing the instructions first, right? Say, okay, well, let's just say we decided to go down path A. Let's write the instructions for a particular audience of like, okay, we're doing this. Here's what you need to do next. Here's why we're doing this. And that act of trying to explain why you made this decision might make you question it. Like, you find yourself, oh man, this is feeling weird. Like these people are gonna be mad at me, or they're not gonna get why we went, right? So, you might, in some cases, kind of make a tentative decision for yourself, start to follow that path, and then see, does this feel right or not?
Right, I like that. And actually brings in what we were talking earlier about this idea of, well, if this was social, this is a social act, what would it look like?
Yeah.
No. And then there's executing, right? That's next.
Yeah. So executing is my opportunity to make the point that the biggest mistake in the execution phase is to think that the planning is done, because this is where you start to build something or carry out a plan, and you realize you made a mistake or something happens, right? Disruption. And so this is where I think the genius of things like Agile and Lean come into play, right? Those are methodologies and principles for planning and doing that recognize the need for improvisation and for additional incremental planning as you go. There's another piece to this, which is it actually makes sense to leave quite a bit of planning until you start building or doing, because until you get there, you're not going to be fully motivated and you're not going to have all the information to know what's going to work best. I have a simple example that I think I use in the book, where when our oldest daughter was looking at colleges, we planned a whole kind of road trip where we spent I don't know, 5 days driving around the United States looking at different colleges. And so that was a big planning activity. I had to schedule, the campus visits and tours, book hotels, kind of figure out how far could we drive, between one college and the other, and what constitutes a day of adventure. And there was a point where I've been planning all this, and I started to look at restaurants, right? So like, okay, we're going to be in Pittsburgh. Where do we want to eat? And then I realized this is crazy. Like, I am not, first of all, I just didn't really have the stomach for more planning. But more importantly, I didn't know what time we were going to pull into Pittsburgh and how we were going to feel, right? Whether we wanted to go out for a nice fancy meal or just get something quick. And I realized, that was a good example where you wanted to, it made sense consciously to just leave parts of the planning until you get there, right? And there's tons of parallels for that. And so you don't need to feel guilty that you push off some of the planning, because it actually makes sense. You're gonna do a better job when you're there.
Right. And interestingly enough, in the information age that we're now in, that type of a sort of logistical planning on an individual basis, we can do much more just in time than perhaps in years gone past. And then you cited some research where they looked at the effectiveness of people if they were upfront planners, or if they were plan as you go, or if they did a mix. What did you find from that research?
Yeah. So the other, beyond the Marine Corps Guide to Planning, the other kind of treasure trove I found in doing my research were a lot of papers in the area of cognitive psychology, where that whole community of academia, they view planning as one of the executive functions of the brain, right? It's like one of a handful of the most important things that our brain does. And so they've studied our ability to plan. And so it's fascinating to kind of look at, how our ability to plan changes as we get older, right? From early childhood through teenage years, and then as we get older, and how planning abilities and approaches vary from individual to individual. One of the tools that they use to study planning ability is a game called the Tower of London, and there's a variant called the Tower of Hanoi. And these are those kinds of, I'll show you here. Here we go. So there's one of them, right? And this is kind of, you're trying to move the discs from one place to another in the minimum number of moves. And that's not the way, that's actually the wrong strategy right there. But, and so what they found is, in versions of this game where you have a small number of discs, then the upfront planners do best, right? So I kind of stare at this for a couple minutes and figure out my moves, and then I do it. That's so with a small number of discs, upfront planners do the best. But if you add a few discs, and the complexity of the challenge expands significantly, then those folks struggle, right? Because we can only fit so many moves into our brain at a time. And it's the folks who kind of plan and move iteratively, right? Who sort of say, okay, let me try this and then take another look. And then, so that fits with what we were just talking about with execution, right? That the executing and the planning are done iteratively. I'm not trying to figure it out all up front. I'm not blindly just doing stuff. I'm carefully making a move and then thinking and then making another move. And so for me, as someone who's more naturally a planner, and as I get older, I work on being better at improvising, right? So that's my weakness. I tend to try to plan too much up front. And so I have, I would say in the last 10 years, I've gotten a lot better at improvising as part of my process in everything that I do. There are other folks who are more naturally improvisers who could benefit from adding a little planning to the process.
Right, and I'm just looking at that Tower Hanoi problem, and so from that basis, if I'm a sort of an agilista listening to this, I'll be like, well, that's music to my ears. Of course, the upfront planners are going to fail. As soon as it gets to a certain level of complexity, we need to switch to this iterative mode. But I suppose to extend that example, in this case, we've got the problem really well framed, right? We know we've got to move this disk from one side to the other. We know how, roughly the field of play in terms of our paths to achieve that. In terms of it's about moving disks across, but actually we've got another order of complexity in a lot of the real world problems we face, where we have to define the board and we have to engage people socially in terms of what we're ultimately trying to achieve. And so it is a different problem to the towers of Hanoi, right?
Yeah, and even when we talk about defining or framing the goal, one of the things that I sort of include in my kind of map of planning, I have a visual that kind of shows the planning process, and is co-goals, right? It's exceedingly rare that we really only have one goal, right? And if you're planning a vacation, the goal is not just to get to Belize, right? You're trying to create a good experience for multiple members of your family, and you're also bumping up against other goals like, I don't want to get fired from work because I went for 6 months instead of a week, and I have a responsibility to not go for too long because we have to put our dog in a kennel or with a friend, and in a work setting, right, the goal is not just to build this website, but members of your team are going to have other projects that they're working on. You're trying to juggle their career development, and their homework balance with achieving this goal. So we're always juggling multiple goals. So yeah, the real world complexity, is just so much beyond these simple games, right? So these games reveal some interesting things around our inherent abilities and strategies for tackling these challenges. Another game or kind of challenge that they use in the research are shopping tasks, right? So they'll say, okay, you're going to the grocery store and these are the 7 items that you need to collect on your way through the grocery store. And here's a map of the grocery store. Figure out your path, right? And so it's another planning challenge where but in the real world, when you go to the grocery store, again, you've got other things that are going on, right? You might decide, I want to stop to get gas. And then you might walk in the door of the grocery store and see someone you don't want to bump into and shift your path at the last second, right? Like, I don't need bananas that badly. I'm going to avoid that person instead. So yeah, real world planning is much more complex. And that's why I think this whole idea of being mindful, of not getting over fixated on your path or your goal, can help people be productive, but also be happy.
Right. Yeah. So it feels like we've had a very good tour through the main thesis of the book. Is there anything we've missed or you'd like to sort of add in terms of reflections on planning?
I think that's been good. I mean, my most fun part of writing this book was, I like to tell stories when I write, and in this book, I really tried to tell stories of failure. Stories of where I tried to climb a mountain and failed because I almost got blown off the side of the mountain, or where I was driving in the Rocky Mountains and hit a sheet of ice and kind of feared for my life. I think that in talking about this topic of planning, it's good to be aware of, on the one hand is the dangers of hubris, right? Like I talk about the Titanic, the unsinkable ship, right? That so many people died in the sinking of the Titanic because it was literally thought of as a ship that couldn't sink, so they didn't have enough lifeboats. That's a good symbol of the dangers of hubris around planning. So I try to make fun of myself with all of these kinds of failures, to sort of set an example. Like the more that we're mindful of how often things don't work out the way we thought, the better we can have a plan, but be prepared to change it at the last minute.
Yeah. Well, that's a wonderful message to end with. All right, Peter. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for your time. And the main places for more, there's intertwingle.org, semanticstudios.com, and then the book available on Amazon. I'm guessing other places, Planning for Everything.
Yep.
Anything else you'd like to shout out? We'll put links in the description.
Nope. That's been a wonderful conversation, and I hope folks enjoy it and learn from it.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, Peter. Thank you for your time. Enjoy your day.
Thank you.